Hey everybody, it's Grayson. Welcome back to the channel, and I hope you're having a great day. I have a confession to make. I used to be a debt collector. Now, before you smash that dislike button immediately, hear me out. I did this back in college because it was a good paying job at the time, and it was leading into or up to the financial crisis in '08. And I only dealt with mortgages. So again, before you smash that dislike button, I wanted to share a couple things about how it worked and what I learned from it. And hopefully it'll share some insight into what kind of happened leading up to the financial crisis from somebody that was talking to the borrowers and the banks at that time. Before I get into it, it'd be awesome if you liked, not disliked, this video and subscribe to the channel. It would really help out. All right, let's go. Okay, as I said, this started back in college and I only did it for about a year and a half because debt collecting is hard. It is a lot of work and you are yelled at more times than my mother would and when I was a small child. It's just not that great, but it paid well for the time. I made 10 bucks an hour in college. I thought I was highfalutin and it gave me great beer money. Let's not lie. Compared to everything else that was charging about $7 an hour, this was an extra $3, so I wasn't complaining. But I found this job and it was for a company that serviced loans for mortgage companies. We didn't originate any of the loans. All we did was manage the customer service and the payments. That was it. But if you know anything about the financial crisis, you will know these two specific names. That would be Countrywide and Bear Stearns. Yes, those two. The ones that went under because of toxic mortgages. Well, this guy right here was the one collecting debts on those toxic mortgages, and I could see the writing on the wall, but I was just too young to understand what was really happening. But now that I'm older, and even after the financial crisis, I realized what was going on. We didn't just service just for those two people, we also did Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and some other banks. And they were all doing the same things. See, the way that it worked was that we would go in to a cubicle room, basically. There's about 30 of us, just a bunch of cubicles. You would sit down, you had a big old CRT monitor sitting on a desktop, you had a phone with a headset, and you would log into the computer. And once you logged in, the auto dialer, which is how you called people, would just start going. And it would throw you borrower after borrower after borrower. And you had about 15 seconds, maybe 10, but around 10 to 15 seconds to read a screen that had about 50 different pieces of information to figure out who the borrower was, where they're from, when the last time they were called, how much is their loan, how much is left on their loan, what's their monthly payment, when it was due, how many days they're behind, who is the mortgage originator, and a bunch of other information. You could also see if they have other debts, other mortgages, other car loans, all this other kind of stuff. A lot of crazy information. You had only about 10 or 15 seconds to grab the pieces that you needed. If they answered the phone, you had to go through a little legal spiel, and then you had to confirm it was them. If they said yes, then you marked the system that you had a good contact, and then you tried to collect the payment. Most of the time, people would just yell at you, but there were some people that were just confused on why they were getting phone calls. And let me tell you why. Because at least back then, and I actually looked at my mortgage documents as well, and they kind of marked the same thing, but it's really hard to find. Back then, if you had a due date, let's say the 1st, and you also had a grace period, which most places give you, which was typically 15 days. The borrowers that we dealt with were between 5 and 15 days. It depended on the originator. If they had paid during that time, they were not getting a late charge. But the day after it's due, they were considered by the company late, considered by the bank late. And that allowed us to then call and collect legally. So you would often call people that were only literally a day late within their grace period saying that their mortgage is late. That was something we had to explain over and over and over again in just one night, multiple times, because it didn't really make sense. And I looked at my own mortgage and it says basically the same thing. This is when it's due. You are technically late after this, but you have a grace period of 15 days and you don't get a late charge during that time. But they can call you if they wanted to. If they wanted to collect that money, they could. So we called a lot of people like this. And there were really two types of borrowers. There were people that were really struggling. These are people that either lost their job This is people that maybe lost a spouse, or they just got approved and signed a mortgage that was well over the amount they could actually afford. This was the largest issue we saw most places. People that never, ever should have been approved for these mortgages were getting approved because the banks then were giving out money like it was candy. If you had a pulse, you could get money. That was the problem. And then we had another side. And these people in particular kind of just played the game and didn't care. And when I say play the game, they basically just collected all the money that the bank would give them. They did not care how much it was. They would just keep getting mortgage after mortgage after mortgage after car loan after car loan, everything. I talked to people that had 2, 3 houses, 3, 4, 5 cars, jet skis, boats, everything. And they were only making like $60,000 or $70,000 a year. You're going, wait a minute, how is this even possible? They can't afford, that's just basic math. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that no one could afford that. And they knew it. These guys, I actually talked to several of them, but one told me in particular, he goes, hey, I don't really care. If they keep giving me the money, I'm gonna take it. And I said, what happens when they go in foreclosure or bankruptcy? He goes, I don't care. It doesn't bother me. I'm just gonna wait till that point and I'm gonna enjoy my toys and then I'll figure it out after that point. To each their own. That was their thing. Now, I think to this day, if you did that now, it would be considered fraud because you were taking stuff you knew that you couldn't pay back. But again, the banks were dumb enough to keep giving them the money. So I didn't really feel bad for the bank and I didn't really feel bad for these people because they knew what they were doing. So we would be calling these people between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. their time zone, Monday through Saturday. We worked about 3 days out of the week because I was a college student and I worked at night. But that was really kind of how it worked. You would sit there and you would call, and then if you were lucky, you would get on what they call inbound. Those are the calls that agents really enjoy because it's typically someone calling to make a payment. Our performance metrics were always around how many payments we can collect per night. It didn't matter if it was outbound or inbound. So we would always try to get on inbound, but the system is what controlled it. It would flip you in and off on inbound randomly throughout the night, and you would try your hardest to stick on inbound because you typically get the most payments. And to be honest, the best day of the entire month, or actually the best 2 days, was the 1st and the 15th, because that's typically when it was due, and that's typically when the late charge was about to go on the next day. So we would get the most payments during that time because most people had due dates of the 1st. So those were our big days. We wanted to work on those days because we had a month quota or kind of numbers, how well you're doing based off of the entire month. So you kind of wanted to work on the 15th if you could. So that's really what it was. But there were a couple things that I learned and it kind of helped me out the rest of my life. It didn't help me out with getting in credit card debt, but it did keep me out of getting into massive mortgage debt. So I want to just tell you about those real quick. The biggest thing is that don't trust the bank when it tells you how much you're approved for. Being approved for something and then being able to afford it are two very different things. See, the issue back then, and it kind of still happens a bit now, is that these people couldn't actually afford the house. While they technically could pay it, they couldn't eat, they couldn't drink water because they couldn't afford to pay for it. They couldn't get groceries, nothing. They couldn't get gas, electricity, any of it. You literally were house poor immediately. Case in point, when I graduated and my wife and I went to buy our first house in 2006, literally right before the financial crisis happened, not a great time, but here we are. We were told by the bank that we could afford $450,000. We could get approved, no problem, they told me, no problem. The problem was that a $450,000 house on a $50,000 combined salary between my wife and I at the time cannot afford that. That is nearly 10x the amount that we make per year. That is a huge no-no. You typically should be focused around 3 times your yearly salary or your yearly household income, not 10. And if we would have done that, if we would have gotten in that house or gotten in a house at that price, we would have been in foreclosure or would have been in bankruptcy within 2 years. Because that is what happened to the majority of the neighborhood that we actually ended up moving into. Because people were buying houses that were well over what they could afford. We actually ended up having a whole row of houses go up into foreclosure around the same time, and we called it Foreclosure Row. It was not great to drive through seeing all the sheriff's labels on the car or in the house doors. But that was what happened because the banks were giving out money that they never should have to people that never could afford it. That was 2008. So you have to be the one responsible for what you know you can afford. Know that number before you ever even get into talking about getting a mortgage. You should know what you can afford, and there are hundreds of calculators everywhere that you can do that based off of the monthly payment that you want. But remember, houses don't just come with the monthly payment. You have maintenance. If you don't have escrow accounts, you have taxes, insurance. Anything that breaks, you're responsible for it. And you have to pay for closing costs. You have to pay for inspections and all these other fees that are tagged on top when you buy a house. It's not as glamorous as everybody wants to make it out to be. So just be careful. And then I understand that how being in debt sucks. I used to be in credit card debt. Now, I never got into, I have a mortgage, but I never overextended myself with a mortgage because of that. But being in a debt collecting agency, I realized that, there are a lot of people struggling out there and they really just don't know what to do. The first thing I'll tell you is that if you are in a spot where you're in collections, just try to be nice to the other person on the other end and hopefully they will reciprocate it. People like myself, when I called people, I was as nice as I could be. I killed people with kindness. I didn't use the aggressive tones. I didn't yell at people, and that worked out well for me. I ended up being quite good at being a debt collector. Now, I only did it for a year and a half because I hated it, but if you're nice to people, it often will reciprocate, and you can get into a understanding. Don't just yell and scream, even though the calls are probably pissing you off. I get it. And then also work with them to try to come up with some type of payment plan to keep you out of foreclosure if you're about to be there. Just keep trying to make as much as you can in minimum payments to keep you in the house. That is going to be the most important thing you can do. You want to stay out of foreclosure proceedings, and the bank really doesn't want to have to go through that. So hopefully you can do that. And luckily for us, since 2008, the lending standards have changed dramatically. They won't do that anymore. They won't package these toxic mortgages and sell them off as investments and then everyone gets screwed over. But you have to be your own master of your finances. You can't let anybody else tell you how well you're doing or how well you should be doing. You have to be the one that is the master of your numbers. That's it. You can't just let anybody else tell you this is what you can do and this is what you can do. You need to know what you can do because at the end of the day, you're the one that's responsible for it. If you sign the paperwork, you're the one responsible for it. So I hope you enjoyed just a little bit of information about what debt collection was before leading up to the financial crisis, which those banks were the leading cause of that. And I appreciate you sticking around. I hope to see you next time on Wealth Bites, and I hope we're just a little bit wealthier.